From the revolutionary T-64 to the imposing T-80, Soviet tanks underwent a metamorphosis that redefined the concept of armored warfare. And how did these steel giants shape modern battlefields? Today, we will uncover the history behind this transformation and understand why the T-80 is considered a milestone in military engineering. For combatants in the war scene, here is the Soviet-era T-64 battle tank. It was developed in the late 1950s and entered service in the early 1960s. So what happens? The T-64 replaced the T-62 in Soviet units. They assigned the T-62 to a secondary role, working with motorized infantry divisions, while the T-64 already featured a series of innovations and was employed in armored divisions, which are the heaviest divisions of the Soviet Union. And what were these innovations? First, composite material armor, a more compact engine and transmission, and a 125mm gun equipped with an automatic loader. The T-64 was quite a light tank for its role, weighing 38 tons. Naturally, over time, the combat vehicle tends to gain weight. Meanwhile, the 115mm gun was too large for the T-55. So, when the T-64 class emerged, they introduced several innovations. This tank has a very low silhouette, and the autoloader, which is the automatic loading system, reduced the weight, reduced the dimensions, and also reduced the crew. They went from 4 to 3 crew members. This formula of the automatic loader is a very interesting aspect of armored vehicle engineering. Now, one very important thing is the composite armor of the T-64. Because this armor can act as it were 450mm thick against heat ammunition and 410mm against APFSDS ammunition, which is the arrow ammunition, as described here, that armor-piercing heat ammunition. What is composite armor? It's the kind that isn't made just of metal. It uses metal, special ceramics, and sometimes some types of plastics as well. And what happens? It is lighter and less bulky than traditional armor, and of course offers significant protection for combat vehicles. And this fact already shows that, for example, there is a completely absurd prejudice here in the West that the Soviet Union was behind, etc. In terms of techniques, that's not quite the case. The Soviets had excellent technologies for their combat vehicles. We will see this in the development of this video. But you achieve all this resistance without increasing the weight. Let's take a look at the tank landscape during the era of the T-64. Then you'll see how Soviet engineering was quite revolutionary in keeping the weight of the T-64 significantly lower compared to its Western counterparts. We have this comparative table of the main tanks in use in the West and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Of course, some tanks that entered service in intermediate periods are missing, but that's not a problem. The important thing is this. We list the T-64 at 38 tons, followed by the American M60 at 50 tons, the Leopard 1 at 42 tons, and the British Chieftain at 55 tons. So you see that by far, the Soviets managed to develop the lightest combat vehicle. Of course, there were other vehicles operating in other countries during this period, but I highlighted those that stand out the most. Soviet engineering put a lot of effort into the reduced weight of their combat vehicles. However, the positive characteristics that make the T-64 perhaps the best tank of its time go far beyond weight reduction. The automatic loader was another factor. It was an easier vehicle to drive because it had assisted controls and better suspension. The 125mm cannon was revolutionary in addition to its composite armor. In short, it was a car that was several steps ahead of its competitors in the West. Well, let's continue to take a look at the car model so we can uncover more details that are very important for you to understand the philosophy of this armored vehicle's design. You will notice that when the Soviets launched the next class, which is the T-80, derived from the T-64, they achieved a reduction of 500 kilograms in the design, which is a feat of military engineering. You got a new, more powerful class with a weight reduction. Well, the T-64 was developed by Alexander Morozov, who had already designed the T-54. It was developed at the Kharkiv Design Bureau, the Morozov Bureau. And it was the first car of the Soviet era to use a 125mm cannon and also the automatic loader, which could reduce the crew from 4 to 3 members. The T-64 was also a pioneer in employing a smoothbore cannon. The cannon had no rifling. But, of course, this also had an advantage because they were able to fire anti-tank missiles through this cannon. Soviet planners considered the T-64 the first of the third generation of tanks and their first MBT, the first main battle tank of the Soviets. This concept of MBT, the Cold War concept, of combat vehicles with more powerful engines, better suspension as well, and lighter composite armor systems. If it had the firepower and protection of a heavy tank, and the mobility of a light tank, a good power-to-weight ratio as well. Well, the T-64 first supplied the Soviet Army and was never exported before 1991, unlike the T-54 and T-55. But several Soviet Union allies from the Warsaw Pact employed the T-64. So, for example, when the Soviet Union ended in 1991, besides Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Uzbekistan had stocks of these combat vehicles. We need to remember that Ukraine is still using these vehicles in the war. Well, folks, let's show the T-64 in detail. So here is the 125mm smoothbore cannon, as I already mentioned to you. It has a 7.62 coaxial machine gun to the cannon. You can see the machine gun installation there, and also a 12.7 machine gun, right? 12.7 millimeters there, which is the tank commander's machine gun installed at the top of the turret. At this point, it's good to point out what the coaxial machine gun is for. As the name suggests, coaxial, coaxis. It is on the same axis as the main cannon. So when you aim, you would theoretically hit the same region. Of course, the cannon has a different range, obviously. But if you see a target that isn't worth hitting with the cannon, you don't need to use the cannon. For targets like infantry, for example, an unarmored vehicle, you use the coaxial machine gun. The 50 caliber machine gun on the commander's turret is generally used as an anti-aircraft weapon against helicopters, etc. But it can also be employed against infantry and some less armored vehicles. There is something almost omnipresent in the Soviet construction philosophy, which is this here. This is a snorkel. They use this snorkel for river crossings, as you can see in the photos. This photo is of another combat vehicle, but it shows the Soviet, Soviet, and nowadays Russian philosophy that a river is not an obstacle for a combat vehicle. You can see that if there are conditions in terms of entry and exit ramps, they conduct reconnaissance beforehand, of course, and ford the river with these snorkels that supply the engine, etc. It's a really interesting technique, because here in Brazil, we usually say that no terrain is an obstacle for the infantry. It seems that the Soviets believe that no terrain is an obstacle for their combat vehicles either. The T-64 also had NBC protection for chemical, bacteriological, and nuclear weapons, and a smoke launcher. Another interesting thing about my model here is this beam, which they also use in the West. They carry it too. Why do we use these beams? Sometimes you have terrain where the mud is very deep and you can't get through even with the tracks. So we use these beams to make this kind of crossing, to overcome these obstacles. So here I'll show you a top view of the T-64. Here is its front view.
Do T-64, aqui é a visão frontal dele, tá? Você tem uma visão frontal bem legal e aqui uma visão.
You have a really nice front view, and here, a view from the rear as well. I'll zoom in here so you can get a general idea of the project. I remember these vehicles are made by Rostros da Historia, right? I'll leave the link here in the description for anyone who wants to place an order. They have various types of armored vehicles. There's an endless amount of armored vehicles. But let's continue our story about the transition from the T-64 to the T-80. But of course, not everything is perfect. The T-64, despite being a light tank, extremely lethal against its Western opponents, had its problems. For example, the autoloader, which is an automatic loader, posed the risk, if the vehicle was hit, of a very large ammunition explosion. The autoloader is also a very dangerous thing. Anyone who has worked inside a tank knows that the environment is extremely cramped. Any deviation of a limb, a hand, a leg, you can be hit by the cannon's operation. And the autoloader was also a danger factor. When the autoloader broke, it was a serious problem because it was difficult to repair, and you had the compromise of the combat vehicle's firing rate. Another problem with the T-64 was the side protection, which wasn't very good. So what happens? In this situation, the ammunition was vulnerable to side shots, and the T-64's engine had some problems, like catching fire. Sometimes, the match could also catch fire. Anyway, the T-64, despite being the most technologically advanced tank of its time, had its limitations. Like any engineering solution, it has its ups and downs, its mistakes and successes, its limitations and possibilities. But the balance of the T-64 is quite positive. Now, I can't help but remember that Ukraine also employed the T-64 and is actually employing the T-64 in this war. They made several modifications. Basically, the Ukrainian T-64BV is the T-64B from 1976. They made two versions, the T-64BM1 without a thermal sight.
O T-64BV ucraniano é o T-64B de 1976, né? Eles fizeram duas versões, o T-64BM1 sem visor termal, né? E o T-64BM2 com
the T-64BM2 with a thermal sight. Now, as the Ukrainians started adding reactive armor to their tanks, they had a lot of problems with the weight. The tank gained weight, as we say. When you add a lot of weight, the engine, which is the same engine from 76, that 700 horsepower engine, will compromise performance. And not just the engine, the suspension also starts to suffer significantly with the increased weight. Another very important handicap is that the 125mm ammunition used by the Ukrainian T-64s was not used or manufactured in NATO countries. So what was the solution? Use Ukraine's old stockpiles, manufacture within Ukraine as the factories did, buy from countries that had this ammunition, several countries did, and captured enemy stockpiles. But when you see that it depends on many sources and there isn't a reliable certain source, you're going to have logistical problems down the line. Well, folks, I'm going to highlight this article here by Dr. Rodolfo. I'll leave in the description the pre-war situation and the perspectives of Ukraine's armored force, where Dr. Rodolfo details not only the situation of the Ukrainian armored force, but also goes into micro-level detail, thoroughly detailing the modifications, the improvements that the Ukrainians made to the T-64 tank family. With the T-64 panel done, the tank dissected, we're going to start looking into the T-80 now. What happens is this. The Soviets realized over time that the T-64 was an expensive tank to produce, and NATO was launching new tanks, like the Abrams, the Leopard 2, the British Challenger, etc.
O Leopard 2 também, o Challenger britânico, etc. Então, era necessário se criar tanque mais confiável, potente.
So it was necessary to create a more reliable, powerful, and adaptable tank for new war scenarios. The Soviets had been pursuing the construction of a turbine-powered vehicle for decades, but in previous years there wasn't a reliable turbine. Until the T-80 project emerged, they had a relatively reliable turbine design that could be the driving force of the new combat vehicle. Well, the T-80 combat vehicle is a creation of Nikolai Popov. So you see here, it has several improvements, right? For example, 2 extra tanks of 300 liters each. These tanks are jettisonable. They can be ejected. You eject them when you no longer need them or want to gain more agility for the vehicle. Another decision-making factor you take into consideration.
Outro fator decisional que você leva em consideração. Ele também tem autoloader que é semelhante.
It also has an autoloader, similar to the T-64's autoloader. And an interesting thing is that they adapted the T-80's cannon to launch the 9M112 Cobra missile. It's very interesting that the tank's cannon could launch the missile. These 2 extra tanks provided a range between 335 and 440 kilometers. It's interesting to add extra tanks because, as we know, this combat vehicle is powered by a turbine, which always consumes more fuel and is noisier. And there's the issue of fuel contamination. The fuel needs to be very clean to operate in a turbine. And let's face it, in the handling of combat vehicles, one of the most challenging things is keeping the fuel free of contaminants. Now, there is an advantage. The turbine has an almost immediate start, while some diesel engines take longer and have this disadvantage.
Já demoram mais aí, já tem essa desvantagem. Então, é lógico, todo sistema é isso, tem vantagens e desvantagens, você tem que ver que é...
Of course, every system has its advantages and disadvantages, and you have to see what seems most suitable for you, your job, and your troops. Now, it's interesting that the Soviets did not skimp. For example, this vehicle has NVG, night vision goggles, for the entire crew, and it was basically created to break through lines. Its low silhouette also contributed to its profile. Very difficult to locate, but of course, this is somewhat offset by the fact that turbines in combat vehicles are quite noisy.
Compensado pelo fato que turbinas em carros de combate são bastante barulhentas. Bom, aí vem aquele pessoal que vai denegrir, porque o T-80...
Well, then there are those people who will disparage, because the T-80 had many losses in Chechnya. Yes, folks, but that is more due to operational conditions, terrain, and experience. Many fighters there were experienced agents from the war in Afghanistan, so it's very difficult to come and blame the combat vehicle. Perhaps other combat vehicles would have had the same problems as well. It's very difficult. You don't have a very large sample size to reach a conclusion, because we see these vehicles being used later in the war in Ukraine and performing very well.
Na guerra da Ucrânia e se saído muito bem, mas vamos prosseguir a nossa análise. Bom, vocês têm aí...
But let's proceed with our analysis. Well, you have a general overview of the main modifications between the T-64 and its evolution, the T-80. So the Soviets managed to reduce the weight from 42.5 to 42 tons by increasing the engine power. Of course, when you reduce weight and increase engine power, you also get a higher speed. They kept the gun and also the automatic loading. Now, one thing needs to be said, right? For the same gun, the T-80 has better performance because of the sighting systems, right?
T-80 tem rendimento melhor porque os sistemas de mira, né, tem uma diferença temporal entre projeto e outro, sistemas de mira evoluídos.
There is a temporal difference between one project and another. The targeting systems have evolved. Of course, you have a greater chance of hitting the target. All of this was implemented in the T-80 model. Another thing they worked on was trying to improve the armor. The tank's capacity was maintained, but, as I already mentioned, they increased performance by reducing weight and making the engine's power available, right? In the end, you end up with a better power-to-weight ratio, which is much better for the T-80. They also added some rubber to the tank's suspension. These are the general modifications. Now we are going to take a look at the models of the vehicles to notice some small details. Follow along with us.
Para perceber alguns pequenos detalhes, acompanhem conosco. Pessoal, deixa eu falar uma coisa para vocês. O nosso vídeo...
Guys, let me tell you something. In our video, we don't tell those wonderful stories about the armored vehicle doing this or that. We stick to technical details. That's what I need to show you. We are going to show some technical conditions here that generally greatly favor the performance of the armored vehicle on the battlefield. Now, if an extraordinary event happened where a warrior destroyed 5 armored vehicles, that belongs more to the realm of fiction than to the military field itself. You have to focus on requirements, whether those requirements are being met. Why? Because the requirements are designed for the average soldier. So when you have those requirements, it's expected that the average soldier will achieve a satisfactory result from them. If someone can, with those requirements, perform miracles, those wonderful things, great, excellent. But that's not our object of study.
Mas não é o nosso objeto de estudo. A gente trabalha com o funcionamento.
We work with the operation of an army. So let's take a look now at some requirements of modern combat vehicles that are quite important for the performance of armies. Well, folks, this is no surprise. It wasn't. No. It's an idea of the most important comparisons of combat vehicles. So, for example, I compared the classes, right, between the T-80 and the Abrams, the Leopard and the Challenger, which are the vehicles currently in conflict in Ukraine. You see that in terms of weight, which I consider one of the most important factors, right? The T-80 is the lightest. You also notice there that its range is very important. The speed is more or less similar. It's more or less on par with the Abrams.
Com o Abrams aí, né? Tanto na velocidade off-road como a velocidade
both in off-road speed and on-road speed. But the power-to-weight ratio, which is its power-to-weight ratio, far surpasses other combat vehicles, especially the British Challenger. There, the ammunition capacity is more or less at the same level as the others, right? And its cannon is noted to be the largest caliber compared to its components. Well, now we need to talk about something quite controversial when it comes to armored vehicle analysis, right? For example, the T-80 has the fewest crew members. All the others have 4. It has 3 crew members. On one hand, in terms of personnel recruitment and the organizational structure of a unit, it makes things much easier.
pessoal, né, e o organograma de uma unidade facilita muito. Mas a verdade é que a carga de trabalho dessa tripulação.
But the truth is that the workload of this crew, especially in the daily tasks of a combat vehicle, which involves quite complex and heavy maintenance, gets you very dirty, and you have to keep climbing up and down the structure, really stresses the crew. A very heavy workload per crew member. Besides the fact that when you have someone injured, if you have 4 crew members, you have 1 extra person. When you have only 3, you will probably end up disabling a function of the combat vehicle. Anyway, there are advantages and disadvantages, but we have to see that overall, the T-80 stands out among other combat vehicles, especially in the aspect you should look at there, the raid, which is the height. It is the lowest combat vehicle in its category, at 2.2 meters compared to 2.49 meters for the Challenger and 3 meters for the Leopard 2A6.
2.2 metros contra 2,49 do Challenger e 3 metros do Leopard 2A6. Que o nosso pátio de estacionamento de carros de combate do Arte da Guerra.
This is our combat vehicle parking lot at the Art of War. So you see in the foreground here the T-64. Then we have a version of the T-80 already from the Ukraine war. And here the T-80 with this anti-drone protection. So here, look in the background, we are seeing other vehicles here in the Art of War parking lot, but they are not relevant today. We just want to show you here, so you have a panoramic view of the evolution of combat vehicles. I'll get another view here as well. The Art of War parking lot is always full, folks.
O estacionamento do carro do Arte da Guerra está sempre lotado, gente, estão sempre fazendo manobras.
They are always making maneuvers. Well, folks, that was our video for today. I think you managed to absorb a lot from it. First of all, the importance of the evolution of a military project. Because between the T-64, a philosophy from the 50s, 60s, to the T-80, which is being successfully employed in Ukraine, we see that the Soviets took everything good from the original design and then improved it. I think that's very important. I always say here in Brazil that if we had improved the Osorio family, where would we be today? And the Russians have this vision. I think all of this is very important.
Essa visão, eu acho isso tudo muito importante. Então, eu acho que esse conceito
So, I think this concept needs to be absorbed here by the Brazilian military mindset, the concept of continuous evolution, of seeking to improve, transform more and more, and increasingly obtain the performance of the material through small enhancements. Thus, the evolutionary importance of a project becomes clear. Why? It's much cheaper. Taking a project and evolving it is more cost-effective than starting from scratch. Starting from scratch, you spend money on the original blueprint, all the design, tooling, the proof of concept itself, approval, modifications, etc. Some things won't work out. When you work on an evolutionary project, you already know what didn't work. You're saving a lot of effort there.
Você está poupando aí muito trabalho. Eles têm essa visão, eu acho tudo isso muito importante.
They have this vision. I think all of this is very important. And also, the existence of project offices. Look at how many good projects this office in Kharkiv, in the former Soviet Union, delivered to the Soviet army, and how much this contributed to the development of the industry. I'll mention here some of the main military design offices in Russia, the famous OKB. They have many there. For example, in the aerospace aviation area, some that you know which are Sukhoi, Mikoyan, which designed the MiGs, Tupolev, Ilyushin, Yakovlev, Beriev, Kamov, which makes helicopters, Kamov 1000. In the missile and space section, you have Almaz-Antey, which designed the S-400 and S-500. Raduga as well, which develops cruise missiles, like the KH-1012, right?
Como o KH-101 também, tá? Você tem a Lavokin, a Ural Vagonzavod.
You have Lavochkin, Ural Vagonzavod, which designed the T-90 and Russia's Armata, and several others, like Rubin, which develops nuclear submarines, for example, the Borei class. Also Vega Radio, which develops radar systems. You see the number of offices Russia has. Just look, and we stop to think about how many we actually have in Brazil. So there's no way to overlook Russia as a power, given the intellectual and industrial capital they have involved and applied in these project offices. I'll leave the jingle there with our course on Russian wars, but leave your like if you enjoy military technology and the history of armored vehicles, and subscribe to our channel for more technical videos on that.
Se inscreva no nosso canal para mais vídeos técnicos sobre esta aí. Deixe seus comentários sobre o que você acha, né?
Leave your comments on what you think about the T-64 and T-80 tanks. And support our channel by subscribing, giving a super sticker or super chat, or contributing via Pix if you can. We'll be back shortly, always with responsibility and commitment. Faith in Brazil, folks. See you later. Well, folks, I'll leave in the link in the description of this video our entire line of books about Ukraine. They're available on Amazon. There's a lot, in various languages and formats. You'll find things on Kindle in print format. What happens is that Amazon delivers very quickly, especially for those living here in the capital, São Paulo. It also accepts boleto, credit card, installments, etc. And I remind you, every time you buy books and other items on Amazon, you're helping the Arte da Guerra channel.
Na Amazon, vocês estão ajudando o canal Arte da Guerra.
Adriana Zanato.